All right. Okay. Thanks, Martha. So before I start, I just wanted to thank the organizers of the forum. It's been fantastic, a really nice, welcoming space online. Online forums can be tiring, maybe more tiring than in-person ones, but I think you've done a great job coordinating and really making it fantastic. So thank you. Thank you. Um, okay. So thanks for joining today. So as I just mentioned, I'm curious to know who you are. We're a relatively small group here, so feel free to chime in the chat as I go through some of this stuff. So I'm curious where you're coming from. I want to reflect a little bit together on, why this type of assignment could be useful for your organization or in the classroom if you're thinking about bringing this in to your teaching. Then more broadly about the concepts of science communication and scientific literacy and conservation and how podcasting can be a tool for students and teachers. Some of the logistics and the audio aspects, which can be intimidating, I think, for some. I've got a bit of an audio musical background, so it's a little bit first nature for me, but I'm happy to walk through some of that for you as well. And then reflect together on how you might be able to bring this to your personal, your profession or your teaching, whatever it may be. So first, I wanted to know where you're coming from. So I was hoping to do a Menti here. Um, so if you're able on your phone, you can just go to menti.com, type in that code there, and click on one of those options so we can see where people are coming from. We are a small crew. Maybe you didn't need the Menti here, but why not?
I appreciate seeing people use different tools, so that's great.
Cool. Hopefully it works. Communicated 12, OSEC. Yeah, I've got the other one here as well for in case I was missing anything. A couple others. Does anybody want to share what the other might be that's not part of this categorization? I'm curious.
I'm one of the others.
Yeah.
Um, I do uh, conservation photography
Okay.
is my primary, but then also podcasting to work in the environmental education and
Okay.
conservation.
Very cool.
Mhm.
Okay. Then our next one here. What type of position? And again, some of these might be other as well. Okay, so it's teacher, communications. Communications, couple teachers. All right, so decent mix. One researcher. Okay, that's a pretty good distribution. That's a pretty good distribution. Um, and we'll just do that as well. Just wondering where you're at in your career. Okay, it's mostly faculty. Okay, that sounds good. I think. All right, so I'm going to jump back to my slides for a second here. Okay, so thanks for that. Thanks for indulging me. Just interested to know where you're coming from, and again, this will inform kind of how I talk about this sort of stuff as well. So this is the Apple podcast page for this assignment that I've created in my course, which the students named "Sink into the Earth," and it is, it's a fair amount of work. It's sort of a term project for the students to do. And then after the fact, there's some work on the back end that I do to assemble these and put them together and publish them. But once you get a bit of a system down, it tends to be pretty streamlined. You can kind of streamline it to be relatively straightforward. Um, I was going to say off the hop here as well that there's no shortage of podcasts out there in the internet space, so I think uh, if you're thinking about doing this in a course or for your organization, it's likely something you should think about as a bit of a passion project. It's highly unlikely, I think, to bank on it becoming financially successful. Certainly in our case, it's just a passion project, educational focused. We don't have any advertisements or anything like that. So just to put that disclaimer there that there's no financial component to this as an assignment. Um, I grabbed a few publications and excerpts from the literature there where, podcasting, because it's seen this exponential rise as a science communication tool, people are interested in, their efficacy. Are they reaching audiences? What did the numbers look like? And so this is just one kind of synthesis figure from this study here by Lewis Mackenzie, where you can see this is the number of podcast series. So there's a huge number that just have a couple episodes, just below 50. And then once those longer running podcasts, they tend to only have a few of those out in existence. So it's just speaking to the fact that it can be difficult to maintain them in the long term, which is why I think in a course context to create it as an assignment, it's something that, again, you're not doing it continually through your academic year. It's something that you've come back to in that regard, and don't have the expectation that it's going to be something that's going to, blow up into be something that's accessed by lots and lots of people. Okay, so I'm curious to tap your brains on a bit of a brainstorm here for what comes to mind, maybe what brought you to this session, and why you think a podcast might be a useful assignment or exercise for conservation or environmental students. So this is back at the Menti here. I think the same code. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, what do you see as the benefits for a podcast assignment, or maybe a podcast for your organization? There's no constraints on this. Alternative to video. Nice. Yeah, one thing I haven't spent time on is thinking about the video aspect. Some people do these video elements to podcasts. That is not a road I've gone down. I think it'd be a challenging one. Audio is usually fairly easy. Outreach to peers, absolutely. Engagement, it's a creativity element. Absolutely. Yeah, I think we've heard a lot of in this forum about, the need for artistic outlets and creative thinking for conservation science as a discipline and also for students. So absolutely. I think for me that's one of the best kind of attractants to this episode, or sorry, to this assignment rather. Um, okay, thanks for that. Um, Okay, so these are just a few thoughts kind of following up on that. So I alluded to this in the introduction. So as you all likely know, conservation environmental science is a very complex discipline. The previous session I was in earlier, we were thinking about parasitism and how that complexity can be a fascinating assignment. And I think the discipline itself really it lends itself to dialogue, right? And more informal discussion spaces, which is why I think podcast episodes can be fantastic. It's also an opportunity for students and researchers to tell a bit of a story about the work that they're doing, some of the nitty gritty details about the places they're going, and fieldwork stories, just them themselves talking about career trajectories can be a really intriguing grounding for a podcast episode. And this idea of creativity, I think we're hearing from students every year that they really enjoy these creative components and creative opportunities. And we talk so much about science communication and the need for developing confidence in how students are talking about science, and also understanding the different strategies that they can use to talk about science. And within conservation science specifically, there are those nuanced elements where these ethical dimensions, these policy dimensions, again, they may not be part of the scientific literature that's there, but students are increasingly asking those questions and trying to draw those connections between the science and the outcomes and the ethics and the economics of these things. And then a big thing that I like to focus in on is the published episode for these students can be something that they put on their resume and their CV as well. Um, with the caveat that they need to opt to have their work published. So I don't mandate that these become published episodes. I ask for their permission to do that. I think there's only been a couple cases where students opted out of it, but usually it's the case that they're interested in doing it. So many benefits there. This is a blog by my colleague Dan Kraus, who worked for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. This is a few years old now, but just to again point out the fact that students are trying to break into the conservation profession, either in academia or outside of it. And I think this idea of creative products that they can work on outside of their education or embedded into their education, adding that to their professional profile looks fantastic. And the way that they structure and how they pursue a podcast episode assignment, they may be interviewing people, building their network. It kind of forces them to understand the big issues and the policy dimensions to the topic that they're exploring. Communication obviously is part and parcel of that, and understanding how to listen and how to interview. So I think it's a great example of how students can think about all these things while also bolstering their professional profile. Okay, so I wanted to talk about science communication and scientific literacy. I alluded to this a little bit in the introduction there. And again, this is a busy slide, I apologize, but these are some science communication and learning objectives that I came across a few years back. And I constantly revisit these for all of my teaching, where all of these different elements, so effective content knowledge, understanding methods, being able to reflect on how students are learning, participate in the science, and whether they think of themselves and their identity as a science communicator. It's not that every assignment that you create in your courses, you have an opportunity to think about all these things, but it seems like for a podcast episode assignment, it's really an opportunity for students to think about all these things, where if they take it on and they really engage with the assignment, I think there's a real opportunity for them to build their confidence as science communicators. So I'll talk about this later on. There are some nerves that come along with presenting and any kind of audio recording that's out there for the public. Definitely, some students have nerves about that, but it's one of those things where to push them a little bit out of their comfort zones. And again, I don't mandate that they do it, but I try to encourage them to work through those nerves a little bit if they're able. And I think the science communication confidence and outcomes are inherent to this as an assignment. So I really like these, and I use these a lot in my learning objectives in a number of my courses. And this is another quote from the literature there, where this podcast episodes and doing that, you can think students can think of themselves as knowledge creators. And it's this creative endeavor and working in groups as well, which we know can be very difficult in certain settings. There's a lot to be gained from navigating that group dynamic and coming up with roles within the assignment, who's going to do what. If you're going to do an interview, who's going to be the interviewee, who's going to do the audio production. There's opportunities to divide up the group work in that regard. But I think many different learning objectives can be gained from this. Um, this I alluded to already. I think conservation science has evolved in the past 5, 10, 15 years to be this interdisciplinary um, behemoth. We're increasingly, and students are increasingly wanting to engage with these other disciplines. They want conservation science to be applicable. They want to see positive change. They're fascinated by the science, by the ecology, by the environment, but they do want to see positive outcomes. And I think where they have an opportunity with a podcast episode to explore that science, but also tell the stories and also look into the policy implications of that science. So there's opportunities for exploration beyond the confines of the conservation science or conservation biology discipline, I would say. Um, this is a study kind of alluding to that same idea there. And I use this when we're talking about science communication in one of my courses where um, it's the conservation discipline. I think we're bombarded with negativity, and students are they're bombarded with this just as we are, and they're looking for opportunities to think about positivity. So how can the science have these positive outcomes in the world? And this is a useful schematic here where just becoming aware of the biodiversity crisis, how to encourage people to seek further information, reinforce positive behavior, positive attitudes, and identify opportunities for the implications of that science or that action, whatever it is, in the community. And this is what students are interested in here. This transformative action. How can we keep people engaged in the conservation science and really make it part of their identities? So I like this schematic just to think or give students an opportunity to find that path to the positive outcome. And again, I think that the podcast episode and telling a bit of a narrative story can be a way to do that. A few more examples here from the literature. I think I'm going to skip past this just in the interest of time because I do want to engage with a few other things. Um, this is I'll focus on this one other thing from the literature here, where it was just a bit of a stock taking of science podcasters. This isn't restricted to conservation, but if you look at the different elements of this figure here, so these are frequencies of communication objectives for science podcasters. The number one just is getting people excited and engaged about the science. But there's a lot of similarity with these other ones as well. So helping to inform people about the issues, showcasing the scientific expertise on different topics, that idea of framing research as it relates to public activities, the general public, um, a bit of the opportunity to highlight the value of science and defend science a little bit. Some students are very interested in that, and let's see here, making sure that science appears as open and transparent as possible, etc. And a few other ones there. But really, I think mostly if you want to create this type of assignment in your course, the students will mostly focus in on this. And I think this is the one, just getting people excited or interested about the science and using these different communication strategies to do that is probably your primary learning outcome or learning objective. Um, okay, so scientific literacy, which I think is science communication is part and parcel of this, but it's a little bit different. So I wanted to probe you again a little bit on what you think scientific literacy is in the context of conservation. So if you'll indulge me with this other mentee here. And this is a tough one. This is a tough question. Any thoughts on that? Well, either people are thinking deeply or there's a lag on my end. I'm not sure. Options for action, parsing threats. Oh, somebody coming in here. Critical thinking, absolutely. Any other thoughts on that one? Caring, interesting. I like that. Yeah, I guess this idea, this question is kind of building on that idea that conservation science is morphing a little bit to include these other, you know, not exactly scientific elements, risks, deep learning, bridging gaps. Facts is definitely part of it, right? Facts is what we think of, I think, intuitively, or that's the first thing that comes to mind. But these other things, um, the actionable outcomes, caring, I think, yeah, these are increasingly things that we're realizing should be part of our scientific literacy, right? Um, Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Um, Okay, I'm going to go back to this. So this again is a busy slide. I'm not going to read it verbatim. I'll just leave it in front of you. But this is the U.S. National Education Standards definition, slightly modified, of scientific literacy. Where I've modified it for biodiversity conservation, but it's about, you know, understanding the science, describing, explaining, predicting, engaging in conversation, understanding the policy angle a little bit. Um, let's see here, understanding the quality of scientific information, the methodologies embedded in that, and the idea of understanding how arguments are constructed and how science is embedded into arguments. So that's, in a nutshell, that's, the classic or traditional definition of scientific literacy. But it seems like what I'm realizing in my courses is that students are really, really thinking about the ethics or value. So there's been a couple of great workshops in this forum about that idea of value as it relates to conservation and conservation science. And it seems like students are really, really, wanting to bring those perspectives into their identities and their understanding of conservation science as well. So, again, the podcast episode and that sort of creative audio format just being a really open format for them to do that. Okay, so I wanted to listen to a couple excerpts from podcasts and see how we feel about them. And this is the kind of exercise I would encourage you to do in your classes if you want to develop this kind of exercise. Um, let me see here. Okay, so I think my audio is going to share. So I'm going to start this and just listen and make some mental notes. Feel free to jot some things down. I just want you to reflect a little bit on what jumps out to you. What are you attracted to in this audio? Are there any things that you think are maybe missing? Just reflect on it. There's no wrong answers. And this is the kind of exercise you could do with your students to identify, those common attractants, I guess you would say. So I'll play this.
You are listening to Season 5 of Future Ecologies.
Okay, here we go.
You know the drill.
Mendel,
Adam.
Future Ecologies.
And this is the last episode of our 5th season.
Thanks for coming with us.
And don't worry, we will be back soon. In the meantime, we're going to be keeping the podcast feed warm and cozy over the summer with a few extra treats for your ears. Today, we've got something really special because it's a story about plants.
It's more of a mystery about plants because despite our budding interest, our story today reveals that many leaves remain unturned.
The story comes to us from journalist and friend of the show, Zoe Schlanger, the author of the newly released New York Times best-selling book, The Light Eaters: How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence Offers a New Understanding of Life on Earth.
Zoe took one of our recorders to the jungles of Chile and back to report on what might just be the world's most ordinary, extraordinary plant. We'll let her take it from here. So, without further ado, this is Everything Will Be Vine.
Broadcasting from the unceded, shared, and asserted territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. This is Future Ecologies, exploring the shape of our world through ecology, design, and sound.
Journalists in my line of work tend to be focused on death, or the harbingers of it, disease, disaster, decline. That is how climate journalists mark time as the Earth passes benchmark after grim benchmark on its way into the foreseen crisis. There's only so much of this that one person can take. Or perhaps my tolerance was thin and easily worn out after years of focus on droughts and floods. In recent years, I'd begun to feel numb and empty. I needed some of the opposite. What?
Okay, I'm going to pause that and go back to the Menti. And I want to hear what you react to in that audio there. So there's the introduction and then that short little beginning of the actual episode, I suppose. But anything that stood out to you as intriguing or attracted you to it or repelled you if you had that type of reaction. I'm curious about anything. Puns? Yeah, that's right. Authenticity. Love it. You're intrigued? The different voices. Yes, absolutely. Good opening line. Yeah. Too long of a transition. Interesting. That's a tricky one, right? The timing of these things. There's no kind of generalizable solution to the timing of transition. Some people like the longer, more spacious transitions. Other people want things quickly, right? That's tricky. Nothing. Okay, somebody didn't like much of anything there. Interesting. Switching between the speakers, international dimension. Host voices are night. Music was a bit annoying, right? That's another one. It's difficult to find something to satisfy everybody there. Okay, that's great. That's great. Okay, I want to do one more, and we'll do a similar exercise. If I can pull it up here. It's this one. Okay, let's try this one. We'll try the same exercise here.
Where's your playlist taking you?
Oh,
Down the highway?
Sorry, there you go.
Over 7 million different animals inhabit our planet.
You know, while you're driving or listening to this, just think, okay, how big is a blue whale in your head? Just for a second. Think, okay.
What can they teach us?
They are the biggest animal to ever live, but they're also the loudest.
Yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so they...
Many species are in crisis and need your help. Join the movement at allcreaturespod.com.
Welcome to the All Creatures Podcast. This is Chris.
And I'm Angie.
Angie, I'm so excited today. Again, I'm excited every day thinking about this stuff, but I'm giddy because I got to pick this one.
Yes, no, and I'm giddy for you, but then once I dived into the research, I found myself just mesmerized and unable to shut down my computer. And this, I probably have the longest notes that I've ever had for any of the species that we covered. Which makes sense. I have the longest and biggest notes that I've ever had because today we are covering...
is the largest mammal in the world and the largest animal ever to live in the world.
Ever. On Earth.
Ever. Yeah. The history, the blue whale. Like, I just am so excited to cover these guys.
The blue whale, I think I've known for a long time that it was the largest mammal on Earth, but I didn't realize that it's the largest animal or mammal or thing that's ever been. I didn't realize that it was bigger than the Brachiosaurus and some of these dinosaurs. That was news to me, and it's... I
would have thought some underwater dinosaur might have been bigger.
Exactly.
But no, we have not found anything as big as a blue whale.
And
all right, I'm going to pause that. I want to save time for some other things. I can listen to these with you all day, but all right. So what about that second one? Same question. I don't want to bias you or prime you from what I'm thinking, but discovery, laughing enthusiasm. Absolutely. They're enthused. Yeah, it feels more informal, I think, the way it's structured. Not that that's necessarily better or worse than the other one, but it's more likely that, if you're going to have students doing something like this, that second one, I think, is likely the type of conversational tone that they'll end up producing. Two voices, too much excitement, too much waiting on the excitement. Interesting. Friendly, some fun facts. Didn't like it as much. Yeah, the passion is there, you can see, but it is more of an informal take, right? So I think what you're seeing between these two different examples is the second one is, much less time put into that, and probably money. My sense is that the other one has more financial background. They're actually sending people places to record things. So you get a sense of the possibilities. And if you're doing this in a course, there are some limitations to the scope and the quality of what will be produced. But the hope is that, you're engaging students and they can find something that they're passionate about. So it's likely that second example is what is more close to what you would get in an assignment, I would say. Okay, so there's a few other ones here, but in the interest of time, I want to move on. So thanks for that. But I think that type of exercise, if you want to do it in a classroom, you get an entire classroom full of students all reflecting together. And there's usually no consensus, right? You see a diversity of responses, which is, I think, fascinating. And people react differently to these things. But you will maybe find a few commonalities for the timing of how things are structured, whether things are too fast or too slow. And that can be, instructional for how students are assembling their own podcast episodes, right? And back to that, science communication angle. One thing that podcasts are great for is, keeping your attention because of that narrative dialogue, right? And usually it's because you've got either the hosts as characters, you're getting to know them on their journey, they're interviewing somebody, and you've got a character there. And, the science and our knowledge of storytelling as a tool is that we're attracted to characters. We want to hear about their journey, positive or negative. That's what we find to be very, very attracting. For my assignment, I don't mandate that students interview people, but I do encourage them to do so because I think it's useful for them to build their network. And it also ends up being a more engaging audio product in the end. It can be a person or it can be a creature, right? So this is a creature that I studied for part of my PhD as a biocontrol for an invasive species. And I think that type of dynamic, it doesn't have to be a human character. You can talk about those those types of relations, biological relations can be equally as compelling as human relations, I would say. This is that same schematic I showed in my introduction there, where I just encourage students to think about framing, the science that they're exploring for their topic or their episode. If they want to have, positive, actionable outcomes, to think about the optimistic or pessimistic framing. Usually we assume they're speaking to other students, maybe other undergrad students, maybe graduate students. So thinking about the audience there and how they're framing things in accordance to that, and a few other strategies for how they're talking about the science. This idea of storytelling, which I just mentioned here as well, and I think this is what podcasts are great for. We're not producing scientific publications, and usually we're not telling stories in there. So a podcast episode is an opportunity to talk about the story of how that science was done. Sometimes the students could create something fictitious, or just interviewing the people that are doing this science or doing that action, and the story of that can be a strategy for creating an engaging product. This is a great science communication tool that a group called Compass Science Communication produced, and it's usually something that is given to researchers that are priming themselves for engaging with the public. You've likely maybe seen something like this before, maybe this exact same thing, where you've got a research project that you're working on or that you've done, and you think about these different angles. So what problem is that addressing? What are the benefits, solutions? Why should people care? What's the audience? So this tool, I think, can go both ways. You can use it as a researcher to prime for outward engagement, or if you're interviewing somebody, you could think about these different angles to the topic or the research or the article, whatever it is, and probe the researchers in that regard. So another strategic tool for thinking about structuring a podcast episode or engaging with an individual, I'd say. Okay, so that's quick primer on science communication and scientific literacy, which I spend a lot of time thinking about. And as I said, it's not. I don't think I'm going to come to a point where I say, okay, I figured it out. I think this idea of scientific literacy and science communication, it's a very amorphous thing where different things work for different people. And having conversations with students and encouraging students to have conversations with practitioners and scientists, I think that in itself, the process is key to the learning objective there. Okay, so I wanted to move on to the logistics of this as an assignment. Is it a nightmare? I'll say no, it's not. It was a lot, I think, initially to think about how to structure it and think about the diversity of student preferences and how to navigate that. But you can come up with a system where it makes it pretty easy, I would say. I think one of the key things that I like to do is give students options. So here's a few students recording a couple years ago. I make it a group assignment, which I think, again, there's a valuable learning experience there as well. I usually I give them the option to ahead of time decide if they are going to publish their episode or not. As I've said, most have decided to do that, and most of them have turned out to be quite good products as well. When I started this assignment, I had the students brainstorm some names for the podcast, then had them vote on it. So they had some buy-in in that regard. So I think it's a useful exercise in that regard. I've been using groups of 3 to 4. Usually the class, it's about 25 to 30 students. And I've got a point here about navigating this anxiety that can be embedded into anything related to presentations. Like people get nervous about in-class presentations, but to have your recorded voice out there on the internet for all of eternity can be a daunting thing. So because of that, what I'll do is give students an option to be either a speaker or a producer on these different episodes. And I'll use those preferences to structure the groups. So first of all, you would collect that information. And And then it ends up being, up to the groups themselves how they divvy up the workload. But usually the producer would be somebody that's maybe dealing with the audio, generating the questions for an interview, finding the literature that they're going to be examining in their episode. So there's a few ways to divvy that up, but just to give students an option, I've found over the past 3 years, it's usually about 3/4 of the students select to be a speaker, and then a quarter will say, I just want to be a producer. So, I recognize there are introverts out there. I think I'm a quasi introvert myself, but you need to have options for them to feel comfortable and still be invested in it, right? Let's see here. These are just a few points about logistics of doing that. So collecting that information, giving them a few days to complete those preferences, also get them to give you different ideas for topics. And again, this is an opportunity to get them to buy into it where, I don't want to dictate what students explore. They're interested in all these interdisciplinary angles. So I like to give them the opportunity to do that. So what I'll do is collect all that and send it back out to them and have them rank their preferences based on what students have submitted. And using that and also what they have submitted in terms of their preference of being a speaker or a producer, you can assemble groups that way. So you don't always have students exploring what is their first choice as a topic of interest, but usually it's in maybe the top 2 or 3. And that works out pretty well. Let's see here. I jumped ahead there. This is just describing that same process where you've gathered their topic preferences and you're iteratively going back to them to assign the groups based on those preferences. You can be the case, and this has happened before, where you have lots of students interested in ecological connectivity as a topic. And that's a huge topic, and it's the kind of thing where you can parse it out into different focal questions where there isn't much overlap. You want them to be exploring different things. So that would be a matter of just engaging with those different groups to ensure that there's no overlap, right? So just some back and forth there. Let's see here. So I also, as I said, I encourage them to reach out to scientists and practitioners to interview them. I think these make for the most compelling podcast episodes where there's a dialogue, people are asking intriguing questions. Most of my students have done that, but some have opted not to and still produced good episodes. So again, you want to give them options and have some diversity of structure there. I usually make the point that as an audience member, so listening to audio, as you pointed out when we listened to those examples there, hearing dialogue tends to be just more engaging. You're more drawn to a conversation than a monologue. There's some research behind that as well. I try to get students to not go from a script. I've found this has been challenging kind of, since the pandemic and everything shifted online. A lot of students are still just going from scripts. That can be a challenging thing. And again, it's not something that you can police necessarily, but encouraging them to make things more conversational is ideal. And you can ask them to, think about these stylistic choices. So you've got these science communication choices. How are they going to be framing or storytelling the various things they're exploring? But do they want to have a playful tone, a serious tone? Do they want to, spark awe and wonder in the people that are going to listen to this? So I challenge them to think about all these things. And then part of their final submission is the audio product, but also a reflection on these types of choices that they were making as they were producing the assignment. This I'm going to skip because I'm talking more than I thought I was going to be. The titles, I think, are critical as well. And this is something, as I'm sure you all know, I think most of us explore podcasts these days, and often it's just the title itself, which can make or break whether or not you're going to engage with something. So I encourage students to think about this as well. And some strategies here can just be simply asking a question, just leaving it out there. What do we know about this? Is this the case? That can be a point of entry for a lot of people. Using some intriguing or provocative verbs can be great. Using some metaphors. So these are some strategies for that kind of first point of contact for a potential audience. And again, it's not necessarily science communication, but it's thinking about how to engage people, which is, I think, part of that process. Interviewing people, this can be tricky. One thing that I've tried to do, so a couple of my student groups have engaged with First Nations individuals and practitioners from our area. We've been able to, because we're at a university, we've been able to access some internal resources for some honoraria, and for those cases, also for early career researchers. Just consider that if you do have the resources to be able to do that. I think that can go a long way. The nitty-gritty details of interviewing, it usually boils down to the Zoom interview, right? So I usually just ask students to arrange their interviews and record them in Zoom. They'll download the audio file from that. The protocols, I suppose, are that I encourage students to send their questions ahead of time to their interviewees so they have some time to reflect on, what they want to engage with. Maybe if there are things they don't want to talk about, just, be a little bit flexible in that regard. Telling students to tell their interviewees that they can play with the audio after the fact. If interviewees want to take a second pass at anything, that's usually easily done in editing suites, which I'll talk about in a second. And one of the challenging things about interviewing in Zoom when you're recording is, sometimes your interviewee will address things that you were maybe going to ask them a few questions down the road. So what students will need to do, and this is not an easy thing, but you need to sort of adapt on the fly, and realize that an interviewee has already answered something, and on the fly you would just remove a question that you were going to ask them. So these are a few things that I encourage them to think about and practice ahead of time. But the worst case scenario is that they just end up doing a bit more splicing and editing in the audio interface, which I'll show you in a second. Okay, so the audio interface, let me see here. I'll just show you this here. So this is the interface for Audacity, which is a free audio software, which you may be familiar with. And this is what I encourage my students to use. So they'll record interviews in Zoom, sometimes record their dialogue in Zoom, but our final editing will happen in Audacity. And there's a million tutorials on how to use this online, but you end up with this WAV file format. And I could just play you maybe a couple seconds of this so you see. So this was a trailer for the second season, I think, of this Sink Into the Earth podcast.
Because people view animals as pests when they are somehow inconvenienced by them. But if we move that dial a little bit to species that are really not necessarily purely detrimental to people, we consider, let's say, coyotes, and then apply the label of pest from some people and the label of beautiful creature by other people. That's really when conflict within society begins to be attached to pests.
Yeah, so I'll stop that there just to show you quickly. This is what it looks like. There's only a few key procedures and tabs that you need to use for this, such as zooming in to the WAV file using these, zooming out. You've got a cursor. You can move things around just by grabbing like this. It's a very, very intuitive interface, and you can see here. So this is music, and then you've got the audio of the snippets from the different episodes kind of stacked back to back here. And once you've got this, you're just exporting the audio as an MP3. It's very, very intuitive. And you can do no wrong, right? If you do something, you just edit, undo. It's fairly straightforward. So I don't have time to go through a full tutorial on this, but I'll tell you that it's quite easy if you haven't played with it before. And the students, you'll find also they're very quick to learn a lot of these things. So that's what that looks like. One thing, just as a for to avoid is Bluetooth headphones and microphones. If people are doing Zoom interviewing, I've come across a few issues with those in the past, so I usually recommend against that. Um, if you don't have resources for microphones and the actual, this mixer setup here, I've found that, usually laptop microphones are quite good these days. And if you're interviewing somebody or doing that, students engaging with each other, as long as they're in a small room and it's quiet, usually laptop microphones do the job just fine. And one thing to be careful of is if you have students recording in Zoom in the same room together, they should be muting themselves when they're not speaking. If they're not part of the conversation, you can get a bit of digital echo, I call it there. So there's a couple options here. So that Zoom interview is a possible approach, or this approach here, if you do have some resources to get these kind of fancier microphones and the actual audio interface, that's when you don't need to worry about that echo there. You're sort of recording in real time. So my students end up using a combination of these different approaches. So just a few, caveats and things to be aware of for the nitty-gritty details there. So Audacity, I think, is a great free resource. I showed you the interface there. Music is key, I think, and there's lots of open access resources you can get for audio and music snippets. You may have creative students in the class that are musical and might be willing to record something and donate it to the podcast. That's an option. Yeah, and then publishing. So what I use is Spotify for Creators, which is it's a free podcast publishing resource. If you're comfortable engaging with Spotify, which I know some people may not be, but in terms of free, easily accessible tools, it is a great one. It does actually have some recording interfaces on its website as well. So there's a number of options there as well. Okay, so for the submissions for this assignment, what I do is have students submit their title, their audio file, a summary of their episode that goes on the podcast page, and then this description of their production process. Whereas that's really an opportunity for you to think about, what types of science communication, scientific literacy, learning objectives do you have in mind? And they may be specific to, a certain subdiscipline of conservation or whatever it is. And in addition to the audio, you can ask them to kind of defend their process and their thinking on how they structured that, whether it's the types of interview questions they were coming up with, the order of how they were putting things in their episode, the details, certain details of the science or the practice, the action that they were focusing in on. So just something to bolster the audio where they have to articulate their thought process and their production process. I think that's a key aspect. Let's see here. If you want to, you can ask them to comment on their group dynamics. Sometimes people will collect this privately, where you've got an opportunity for students to kind of not grieve, but highlight any challenges. If groups can be challenging where certain individuals are maybe not holding their weight, sometimes you can tease that out in those types of interactions. And if you're thinking about doing this, thinking about having this public-facing podcast, you're going to need a logo. You can either do this yourself or maybe get your students to do it. I think a lot of people are using AI nowadays for this kind of thing, which I don't love, but it might be good for brainstorming if you're feeling stuck. I'm going to skip that because we got 5 minutes left here. And this is what I ask students to submit, kind of part of the assignment. And I think I've shared this with the forum organizers, so this will be fully available to you to adapt as you see fit. with some, word limits for various things, and the different aspects of the description of the production process that I asked them to give me. Um, I've got a couple examples here of the rubrics, and I'll also upload these to the whatever shared resources we have, where it's a gradient of quality. Where ask students, they need to have some kind of hook in their audio that draws you in. What's your assessment of how effective that is? Are they communicating the focal content, in a very insightful, investigative way, drawing from very appropriate sources, etc.? So these are a couple of the things, and then I've got a few other slides that I'll just skip here. But I do this for both the audio itself. So I listen to the audio and evaluate it on these different criteria. And then I do the same for the episode summary and that explanation of the production process. So I'll share all this, and feel free to adapt it as you see fit. And I found that it's been a great pedagogy exercise, and publishing it, I'll honestly, it's something that I come to maybe a month after a course is complete, because I have other things to do as well. But I do get them all up, and I'll let the students know after the fact, and it does get up on their CVs, and the feedback's been great so far. So let's see here. I think I've said all this already. I think, they're building their network. I don't think your goal should be a successful podcast necessarily to get loads and loads of listenership, but really, the major benefit is that it's a learning experience for these students, and it should be a fun exercise. It's an opportunity for them to find some positive interaction with their peers and positive stories in conservation science, which I think is, it's something that we need these days. So in that regard, it's been fantastic, a fantastic part of my course. You could use AI to do all this. It's not my thing. I prefer humans, but there are these tools out there that do that, but I wouldn't recommend it. I've got several references there from the literature that I explored. And I just want to thank all the contributing students that have been part of this assignment over the years. And our department kicked in some cash for microphones and gear. So I wanted to leave more time for chatting, but I talked too long. I'm sorry about that. But I thank you for listening. I hope it was useful. But maybe in the last couple of minutes, if you have any reflections quickly, we could talk about them.
I have one quick question, which is how much time do you give them in class to do this collaborative work?
Yes, usually maybe across the entire semester, probably maybe 5 hours. So I give them time in class to talk about their topics, to kind of come up with their structuring. The class is usually 3 hours a week. So maybe for 5 of those weeks through the semester, I'll give them half the class to work on it. And then they have to do the recording sort of outside of class, where I can book space on my campus and have them go, and they can have a space to actually work on the recording and the interviewing and all that kind of thing. So it's a combination of in-class time and then a little bit of out of class time doing the recording.
Thank you. Maybe it's one last thing too, can we follow up and ask questions?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think I could put my email in the chat.
Great. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you.